At the time, I had just moved into my grandparents' house. They had passed away a few years ago, and my parents decided I could live there since I needed more space and was trying to save some money. The house was a bit far from the city, in an area where the streets were practically deserted at night. It was an old house, with that typical smell of aged wood and a decor that seemed stuck in the 70s. I had always had good memories of the place, so at first, I saw it as an amazing opportunity. During the first week, I focused on organizing things, especially the basement, which was a mess. My grandparents had kept all sorts of things down there, old furniture, boxes of trinkets, tools. You know those rocking chairs that look like they're straight out of a horror movie? There was one in the corner, covered in dust, and every time I passed it, it gave me a strange chill. I didn't think much of it, figured it was just paranoia from being alone in such a big, old house. But one night, as I was putting away some boxes, I noticed something bizarre. The shadow of the rocking chair on the wall was moving, as if someone were sitting in it, rocking slowly. The problem? I was on the other side of the basement, and that chair definitely shouldn't have been moving. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, maybe the dim basement lighting creating weird shadows. I turned off the light and left quickly, but that image stayed with me. That night, I locked the basement door, something I don't usually do, just to be safe. I thought I'd sleep peacefully, but I woke up in the middle of the night to a faint noise, almost like scratching, coming from downstairs. My first thought was that it was a rat or some small animal. After all, the basement had been closed up for a long time. The next day, I went down to the basement with a strange feeling, trying to brace myself for whatever I might find. I looked around, and at first glance, everything seemed to be in place, but I had the impression that some things had been moved. The rocking chair was facing the stairs, as if someone had dragged it slightly, and a few objects I had neatly organized were scattered around, like someone had been rummaging through them. I decided to ignore it and tidy up again, trying to stay calm. But as I was leaving, I noticed something strange in the corner of the wall, a shadow that didn't match anything in the basement. It looked like the silhouette of someone standing there, watching me. That sent a chill down my spine, but all I could do at that moment was stare at the shadow for a few seconds, hoping it would disappear or transform into something that made sense. But it didn't. The shadow stayed there, motionless, as if it were observing me. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and left the basement as quickly as I could, locking the door behind me. That night, I barely slept, and the little sleep I got was filled with confusing nightmares, always with the feeling of being watched. I even thought about asking a friend to stay over for a few days, but I knew he'd just laugh and say I was losing it. Over the next few days, I tried to avoid the basement as much as possible. I only went down when it was absolutely necessary, but every time I set foot there, the feeling that I wasn't alone grew stronger. On one of those trips, I found one of my grandparents' picture frames on the floor, its glass shattered. The strangest part was that the frame had been securely mounted on the wall the last time I saw it. It didn't seem like it had fallen on its own, it looked like someone had yanked it down. I started to wonder if a neighbor might be playing tricks on me, but that was impossible. The basement was always locked, and I was the only one with the key. The night started getting even more unsettling. I would lock the basement door, double-check it, and still wake up in the middle of the night to those scratching sounds and light tapping on the door, like someone was trying to get my attention. It was an insistent noise, and I'd lie frozen in bed, my heart racing, just listening. The more I ignored it, the louder and closer it seemed to get. One night, I decided to record the sound on my phone, just to make sure it wasn't all in my head. What I heard the next day was worse than I expected. When I played back the recording, I could clearly hear a whisper, very faint, but unmistakable, as if someone were softly repeating my name. I was so shaken by that I decided to tell my mom, trying to make light of it but really looking for some reassurance. However, she turned serious immediately and told me something I had never heard before: my grandparents had always avoided the basement. She said that when they moved into the house, they had heard noises and noticed things out of place down there but brushed it off as quirks of an old house. My family was never one to believe in those things, so they left it at that. Her story only made me more uneasy because it seemed like something was really trying to get my attention. After that conversation with my mom, I started paying even closer attention to everything. One night, just before going to bed, I noticed that the basement door, which I had locked as usual, was slightly ajar. My first reaction was panic. I vividly remembered locking that door as firmly as possible, almost like I was desperately trying to keep whatever was down there contained. Grabbing a flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest, I silently went down the stairs, straining to hear any sounds. The house was completely quiet. With the flashlight trembling in my hand, I descended into the basement. I scanned the area, looking for an explanation, and that's when I saw it. On the opposite wall, there was the shadow of a human figure, standing perfectly still and facing me. I stood frozen for a few seconds, unsure of what to do. The shadow didn't move, but it seemed denser, darker than any normal shadow. What was strangest of all was that there was nothing in that corner that could cast a shadow in that shape. It was a perfect silhouette, as if someone were standing there, watching me. I tried to swallow my fear and muttered, "Is someone there?" as if that would somehow solve the problem. But, of course, there was no response. I took a step back, thinking about getting out of there as quickly as possible, but before I could turn around, I heard a low sound, somewhere between a whisper and a groan. That was all it took to send me racing up the stairs, not daring to look back. I locked the basement door with so much force that I almost broke the key. That night, I decided I wasn't going to sleep there. I grabbed my keys and went to a friend's house, giving only a vague explanation of what was going on. He thought it was strange but didn't ask questions, and I was thankful for that. The next morning, I returned in daylight, trying to convince myself that it had all been an exaggerated nightmare, a mix of fatigue and paranoia. When I got back home, the discomfort was less intense in the daylight, but the eerie atmosphere hadn't disappeared. I went down to the basement to check if everything was in its place. I stood there for a while, trying to figure out if what I'd experienced was some kind of hallucination. But what disturbed me the most was realizing that even in the daylight, I still felt like something was watching me. Over the following days, I tried to go about my life as usual, focusing on work and avoiding thinking too much about what had happened. But on the third night after I changed the lock, I woke up in the middle of the night to a loud thud, almost like a crash, coming from the basement. My heart immediately started racing. I got out of bed, trembling, and walked to the hallway, where I could see the basement door. It was wide open, the new lock shattered on the floor. At that moment, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong with that house, something that seemed directly connected to the basement. Despite my overwhelming fear, I decided to go down there, but this time, I wasn't going alone. I called my friend, the same one who had taken me in that night, and begged him to come over and help me. He arrived in less than 20 minutes, and when he saw the situation, he realized I wasn't joking. We went down together, armed with flashlights and a wooden stick he'd brought, just in case. With every step down the staircase, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. When we reached the basement, the atmosphere felt darker than usual, even with our flashlights. My friend started looking around while I kept my eyes fixed on the rocking chair. Suddenly, he whispered to me, pointing toward a dark corner of the basement. In the dim light, we could see something moving slightly, a shadow twisting and contorting, as if it were alive. Neither of us could move, frozen by what we were seeing. Then, the shadow took on a fully human shape, but with distorted proportions, a tall figure with arms and legs far too long to be normal. It simply stared at us for a few seconds before moving toward us. The moment the figure moved, my friend and I bolted up the stairs, stumbling over everything in our path. We didn't exchange a single word until we were outside the house, the doors locked behind us. We sat in the car, trying to make sense of what we had just seen, too scared to go back and check. My friend was pale, and my head was spinning as I tried to process what had happened. As absurd as it all, I had decided to stay home that night. It was the weekend, and while my friends were making plans to go to the park or the drive-in, I knew I needed to study. Final exams were coming up, and my mom kept reminding me that I was failing chemistry. Our house was on a quiet street, with only a few homes around, surrounded by tall trees that made the place feel even more isolated. It was an old wooden house, and the creaking of the structure in the wind was normal to me. I grabbed a few books, threw them on the kitchen table, and started reviewing. The hours passed slowly, and around 10 at night, I noticed something strange, a burning smell. At first, I thought it was the kitchen light bulb, which flickered every now and then and seemed old. I turned off the light and looked around, but I didn't see anything. I opened the oven just to be sure, but it was empty. The smell was faint but persistent, like something burning far away, barely noticeable. I thought about opening the windows to see if it was coming from outside, but the cold night air discouraged me. I sat back down and tried to ignore it, but as I read, the smell seemed to grow stronger, invading my nose. It began to bother me. I got up again, but this time determined to find the source of the smell. I walked through the whole house, starting with the living room, where everything seemed normal. The hallway was the same, nothing out of place. When I got to my bedroom, it was exactly how I had left it, a messy bed, books scattered on the desk. That's when I noticed something that made me uncomfortable. The smell was stronger there. I reached for the light switch and flipped it, but the lights didn't come on. Strange, because I was sure everything had been working fine. The smell, however, was so strong that it made me start coughing. Then I heard it. A low sound, like something heavy pressing on the old wooden floor. I froze, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The noise was faint but impossible to ignore, like slow, deliberate footsteps. I turned toward the window, thinking maybe something was happening outside, but the sight of the dark room gave me chills. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and walked toward the doorway. When the light illuminated the wooden floor, I noticed something strange: footprints. They were black, as if someone had walked barefoot with ash-covered feet, and they led straight into my bedroom. My heart started pounding faster. Footprints. Inside the house. I lived with just my mom, and she was out of town that weekend taking care of my grandmother. There was no one else but me. I was terrified, but I followed the footprints, the flashlight in my trembling hand. The prints were uneven, some more defined than others, as if whoever left them was struggling to walk. The closer I got, the more the burning smell became suffocating. It wasn't just unpleasant now, it was nauseating, like old smoke mixed with something rotten. When I stepped into my bedroom, trembling with fear, everything seemed normal at first glance. The smell was strongest there, but there was no sign of fire, nothing out of place. That's when I realized the sound had stopped. I tried turning on the light again, but the switch still didn't work. I took a step back, turning toward the hallway, and that's when I saw it for the first time. A dark figure standing between my bed and the wardrobe. At first, I only saw two long, dark arms, with skin that looked charred and deformed. The hands moved as if pulling the rest of its body out of the shadowy space between the wardrobe and the bed. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I stood frozen as the thing emerged completely, standing tall in front of me. It was a tall, thin figure, and it had no eyes, or at least not where they should have been. There were only two deep, dark holes, black as night. I froze. My entire body went rigid, as if my muscles had locked up completely. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me with those empty holes in its face. It didn't make a sound, but there was something about it that made me feel like I was being watched by something not human. My throat went dry, and no matter how much I wanted to run or scream, my body wouldn't respond. All I could do was stare at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then it started to move toward me. I heard the creaking of the floorboards, as if it was much heavier than it looked. That broke me out of my trance. My body finally reacted, and I took a few steps back, almost tripping over myself. My hands were shaking so much that I nearly dropped my phone. The flashlight barely illuminated the room, but it was enough to see the thing moving toward me, dragging its feet. It didn't look like anything I had ever seen before. The smell was unbearable now, clinging to my skin and filling the air, as if the house itself was burning from the inside out. My first instinct was to run. I didn't think about anything else except getting away from that thing. I bolted down the hallway, almost slipping on the floor, and ran toward the first door I saw. I could hear its footsteps behind me, slow, heavy, but fast enough to keep me from feeling in control. The only thought in my head was to reach the bathroom, lock the door, and pray it wouldn't be able to get in. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would explode. As soon as I reached the door, I slammed it shut and turned the lock as quickly as I could. For a few seconds, all I could hear was my own breathing. The smell of burning had followed me, but it was even stronger now, like it was embedded in the air around me. I leaned against the door, trying to think of what to do. That's when I heard it, a low scraping sound, like something dragging against the wood. It was on the other side of the door. The doorknob started to turn slowly, and I froze. How was that possible? I had locked the door. Even so, I heard the click, and the knob turned completely. Before I could react, the door opened on its own, and the bathroom light went out. In a desperate impulse, not even knowing why, I turned on the shower. Water began pouring out, and I huddled under it, trembling and bracing for the worst. The water was ice cold. In my panic, I hadn't even adjusted the temperature. It dripped onto my head, ran down my face, and soaked my clothes, but that was the least of my concerns. The thing stopped at the bathroom doorway, staring at me, or at least I thought it was, since I could barely see in the darkness. It took a step inside but then stopped abruptly, as if something was holding it back. I stood there, pressed against the shower wall, and then I realized, the water. It wasn't moving any closer, but it also wasn't leaving. It seemed to hesitate, as if the water created a barrier between us. It began moving strangely, almost as if it were irritated. Its shoulders twitched, and its head tilted slightly from side to side, like an animal trying to understand something. Every step it tried to take toward me, it was forced to stop, retreating slightly. The tension was unbearable. I had no idea what was happening, but the water seemed to be keeping it at bay. Then it made a sound. It was low, like a muffled hiss mixed with a growl, but it wasn't human at all. It was the most unsettling sound I'd ever heard, and it only made me curl up tighter in the shower, with the water still pouring over me. I stayed there, huddled on the floor of the shower, shaking and trying to keep my eyes closed. The thing wouldn't leave. It just stood in the doorway, moving slightly, as if impatient or frustrated. Its breathing was irregular, a raspy sound that seemed to come from deep within, mixed with the unbearable smell of burning. I didn't dare turn off the shower, and I wasn't sure I could move even if I wanted to. My legs were numb, my body soaked, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. The hours passed slowly. The thing didn't disappear, but it didn't come any closer either. Sometimes it would step into the bathroom, testing the water's barrier, and then stop. At some point, exhaustion overcame me, and I must have dozed off for a few minutes. When I woke up, the bathroom was brighter. Sunlight was starting to come through the window, and that's when I noticed, the thing was gone. The smell of burning had vanished too. I waited a few more minutes, still with the shower running, before I finally worked up the courage to leave. My hands were trembling as I turned off the water and opened the door. I walked down the stairs slowly, my heart still racing. Every step felt like a risk, as if that thing could reappear at any moment. When I got to the living room, I noticed the burning smell was completely gone. The scene felt surreal, like I'd just come out of a nightmare, but it was far too real to have been my imagination. I spent the rest of the morning drying the bathroom, changed my clothes, and threw the wet ones into the washer. I wanted to erase any trace of what had happened, as if doing so could make it all disappear. But it was a Friday night, and I was home alone. My parents had gone on a trip to the countryside and wouldn't be back until Sunday. After dinner and spending some time on my phone, I realized the house was eerily silent, a heavy silence. I ignored it at first, but everything changed when I heard a creak coming from the living room. It sounded like someone stepping on the wooden floor. Slowly, I stood up, trying to listen more carefully, but the noise continued, steady, like slow footsteps. I walked to my bedroom door and peeked into the dark hallway. I didn't see anything, but the sound seemed to come from the base of the stairs. I closed the door, locked it, and sat on the bed, trying to ignore the fear creeping over me. Shortly after, I heard another sound, this time closer, like someone breathing heavily on the other side of the door. My body froze. I grabbed my phone and illuminated the floor with the flashlight, trying to make as little noise as possible. Pressing my ear to the door, I listened, but everything went silent again. That only heightened my sense that something was wrong. After a few minutes of trying to muster some courage, I heard a louder noise, something being dragged across the living room. The sound was so clear it was impossible to ignore. My heart raced, and I decided to leave the room. I opened the door slowly, phone in hand, and shone the flashlight down the hallway. It was empty, but something told me I wasn't alone. I crept down the stairs as quietly as I could, the flashlight shaking in my hand. When I reached the living room, everything seemed in place, but the rug was askew, and the coffee table looked like it had been pushed. It didn't make sense. There was no one there. I went straight to the front door, determined to leave the house, but the key wouldn't turn. It was as if it was locked in a way that couldn't be undone. Panic began to set in. As I tried to force the key, I heard footsteps upstairs, slow, heavy steps. I froze, staring at the ceiling as the sound continued. I grabbed a lamp from the living room as an improvised weapon and started climbing the stairs, each step more tense than the last. When I reached the top, I saw that the door to my room, which I had left open, was now closed. I stood still for a moment, trying to decide what to do, until I heard a noise from inside the room, something scratching the floor. That was enough to make me open the door. As the hallway light spilled in, I saw something I will never forget. In the corner of the room, with its back to me, was a crouched figure. It looked human, but its posture was strange, as if its body was contorted unnaturally. I froze, not knowing what to do. The thing began to move, but without standing up. Its head jerked sharply, as if it had noticed me. My whole body locked up, and before I could react, it turned its face toward me. The face was wrong. It didn't look human. It was distorted, almost like it was blurred. In that moment, all the air left my chest. Without thinking, I dropped the lamp and ran. I stumbled down the stairs, the phone's flashlight swinging wildly, and went straight for the front door. This time, the key turned. I yanked the door open so hard it slammed against the wall, and I ran outside without looking back. I ran to a park near my house, my heart pounding like it was going to explode. I had no idea where to go, but I couldn't stop running. When I realized I still had my phone in my hand, I tried calling someone. My dad didn't answer, and neither did a friend. I ended up calling the police, unsure how to explain what had happened. I just said that someone was in my house and asked for help. They said they would send a patrol car and told me to wait where I was. Even after hanging up, I kept staring at my house from a distance, with the constant feeling that any moment that thing would appear. When the patrol car arrived, I explained everything to the officers, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They told me to stay in the car while they checked the house. I watched them go in with flashlights and heard muffled sounds from inside, like something being dragged. After a few minutes, They came back out and said they hadn't found anyone, but the floor in my room was scratched, and the window was open. I insisted that I had seen something, but they treated me as if I was exaggerating or imagining things. They said they would patrol the neighborhood and left me there, alone again. After they left, I stood on the sidewalk, staring at the house. I didn't have the courage to go back in, but I didn't know what else to do. I called a cousin who lived nearby and asked him to pick me up. While I waited, I kept my eyes on my bedroom window. I swear I saw a shadow pass by inside, very quickly. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks, but it felt so real. When my cousin arrived, I got in the car without saying much. He asked what had happened, but I just told him I needed to get out of there. I spent the night at his place, but I couldn't sleep. After that night, I was never comfortable in my house again. Even during the day, I felt like something was watching me, like it was still there, hiding. My parents never understood why I insisted on selling the house, but I knew I couldn't live there anymore. What I saw that night wasn't human, and the feeling of dread still lingers with me to this day. No matter how much I try to forget, I can't stop hearing that sound, the footsteps upstairs and the heavy breathing on the other side of the door.
Hello. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with your friends. This helps us grow and bring even more new content. Thank you, and see you next time.